Trigger warning, viewers. You've entered a very unsafe space. Welcome to Mark Latham's Outsiders, Australia's most politically incorrect news and current affairs show. We've got a very, very busy program this evening talking about housing affordability, domestic violence debate, the madness of the Victorian government trying to brainwash 4-year-olds who've been identified with sexist behaviour. And of course, we want to have as much Q&A with you, the audience. We've got some wonderful questions that have been submitted. We'll be trying to answer those as best we can because the whole spirit of Mark Latham's Outsiders is free speech, no political correctness, and to talk honestly and openly about the issues of concern to the Australian people. Plenty of things going on in our country that are very worrying indeed, so we talk about them in a way you don't find in the mainstream media. This is free TV, no ads, and no political correctness. It's wonderful to be joined on our second show by Miranda Devine. How's your week been?
Very well, thanks, Mark, apart from the rain in Sydney.
Oh, well, it's been around forever. Yeah, we are used to it. And Bettina Arndt, thanks for joining us again.
Pleasure to be here.
And some updates, please, on the domestic violence issues. Senator Leyonhjelm's been asking some very good questions in the Senate. And I think there's some breaking news about the Red Pill movie and what's been happening at Sydney University.
Yes, well, the Red Pill, wonderful thing. We talked last week about the Red Pill, this movie made by a young feminist looking at men's issues, which extremists tried to get banned in Australia last October. And we've finally got screenings happening all around Australia, except, of course, at the University of Sydney, where a young student decided to put on a screening of this movie, and the Union of Students announced that they weren't going to let her do that. I gather, Miranda, you said that she's managing to find a way around that.
Yeah, Renae Gorman is the young woman, 24 years old, and she's the lead organiser for the Red Pill, this movie that feminists love to ban before they even see it. And Sydney Uni, now the Union, even though these societies that she's part of, the Liberal Conservative student parties, they pay their union fees, quite exorbitant fees, to be able to use venues like the Manning Bar, but they're now banned from those because of a handful of complaints from some uber feminists. So instead now Renae, I'm happy to say, has decided that they're going to put up the money themselves and they are going to be showing it on May 4 in the Law Lecture Theatre.
Well, that's fantastic. And we've got screens. We've even got a movie theatre in Brisbane deciding to put it on themselves. So it is spreading across Australia. We're getting more and more people coming along to see this, and I think that's really important. I had this movie theatre in Avoca, which constantly shows movies about women and women's liberation and so on, and we thought there's no way they're going to show it, and lo and behold, they saw the movie and they decided it was a really important movie for people to see. So
well,
they're putting
the
it on.
best way to ensure that you get an audience for something is to ban it.
I know.
Well, it's a sign of what's happening in our universities, that places that are supposed to be for academic inquiry, investigating facts, learning, developing knowledge, their response is to ban things that they've heard about, haven't seen it themselves. So, there's so many things going wrong at the universities, safe spaces, trigger warnings, all this sort of nonsense. So it's an age of repression, isn't it?
And a huge anti-male culture, growing anti-male culture on campuses. A fascinating thing. I mean, we've had a number of incidents where kids, young boys entering college, out there having on their orientation days singing bawdy songs, a noble tradition. And of course they've been jumped on and they're told they're not allowed to sing these sort of things anymore. And the university have caved in and reprimanded them. And we've had, last year, this was at University of New South Wales, and what I loved was one of the songs they objected to. One of the lyrics was, we'd like to tickle your clitorises. And I would have thought that's exactly what we've been trying to get men to do for many centuries. And lo and behold, that was one of the offensive songs that they objected to. But it's actually a really serious issue.
Weren't you teaching that as a sex therapist?
I've been trying for a long time. But to use this as an example of this rape culture to me is totally absurd.
It's foreplay culture, isn't it?
One would hope so.
Yes, I think we should all be for that.
Yeah.
The insidious thing about the colleges at Sydney University is, though, that Liz Broderick has been brought in and she's being paid an exorbitant amount of money by the colleges to come in and do to the colleges what she did to the army and to the AFP and so on, and to basically stamp out gender inequality, which really means stamp out any male culture. So if you have a a college like St Paul's College, which is an all-male college, how are you going to stamp out the male culture?
Well, the other thing that's been happening, interestingly, the Human Rights Commission, already we're worried because we've mentioned them, the Human Rights Commission has been conducting survey material about sexual assault on university campuses. But before they did the surveys, they were salting the mind because Gillian Triggs was going to deliver lectures to say this is a big, big problem. And they were showing a movie that had been discredited out of the United States, saying that it's rampant on all university campuses, the level of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I think it was 19 Harvard law professors came out and discredited the movie, said that it made false allegations against one of the male students who featured. So they're salting the mind, and I don't think we can rely on the material that comes out from the Human Rights Commission because it's a jaundiced process and survey.
And that survey, that movie, The Hunting Ground's been shown on campuses right across Australia. It's misleading propaganda, really distorting this whole idea around rape culture on campuses. And as you say, the Human Rights Commission is out there doing this survey, which we know is only going to be filled in by people who are self-selected, so the people who have some sort of axe to grind. It's based on a Union of Students survey that was done where they included things like someone staring at you in an appropriate way.
That's right.
It's not nothing not just to do with touching; it's to do with anything you find remotely
And
offensive.
all that does is trivialise genuine sexual assault
does.
by pretending that everyone's been raped.
Yeah, the definition is very, very wide.
Very
Stare
wide.
at a woman, and you might be
Wolf whistle.
Well, you might be sort of thinking, do I know her from somewhere? You know, like, and you're looking for what's regarded an excessive period of time. That's counted in as a form of sexual harassment.
And in fact, the Union of Students found 73% of women had experienced some sort of unpleasant sexual behaviour, and it turned out a lot of those incidents took place off campus. University students are far less likely to experience any sort of serious sexual approach or sexual assault than students in some of our more, lower socioeconomic areas of Australia. It's just nonsense to suggest this is a particularly vulnerable group of women.
Well, that analysis is also true in the domestic violence debate. And I know, Bettina, you've been looking at some excellent questions and some inadequate answers. In the Senate, Senator Leyonhjelm's been asking the questions. The department there hasn't been able to provide, in its extensive research budget, any justification for their theory of patriarchy, because this is where the whole debate comes from. The left feminists, the neo-Marxist theory, are arguing that every man in every circumstance under patriarchy is oppressing women and getting violent. Now, it defies logic. There can't be a culture of patriarchy if in the university sector 60% of the graduates are female. There can't be patriarchy in Australia if there's 100,000 more men suffering and experiencing and living out long-term welfare dependency than women. It can't be patriarchy if females are dominating the law profession, for instance. So it's not surprising they haven't been able to justify this. So what's the detail from Senator Leyonhjelm?
Yes, well, Senator Leyonhjelm was one of the few politicians in Australia who's taking on this vast domestic violence industry and asking questions that need to be answered. He's been up in Senate estimates asking questions about the statistics on this, asking what is the evidence that domestic violence is all about gender, is all about attitudes of men towards women. What is the research to suggest there's actually any epidemic of domestic violence? Of course, we've all written about this. We know the evidence suggests strongly that domestic violence is actually going down in Australia. We should be celebrating that. But of course, this vast industry that's living off this notion that it's an ever-growing problem doesn't want to listen to that. And Leyonhjelm has asked questions about that, a whole range of issues. And I think good for him that he's actually standing up to and putting people on notice that these questions need answered.
But the federal government department couldn't put up the research findings to say that patriarchy exists and this is the basis.
Well, they're questions on notice, so I think we'll have to follow this story up.
We will follow it.
But
Miranda, you've written about it today.
And the point about Senator Leyonhjelm's questions is that he asked these two women who are the public servants from the Department of Social Services who are in charge of one of these many government-funded domestic violence programs. This one is called Stop at the Start. And the thesis of it is that that gender inequality is the cause of domestic violence. So there's no evidence for that. And Senator Leyonhjelm asked these two women, who are the architects of this program, they run this program, how, did they spend money on research? Yes, they spent, they said $400,000 on research. And he said, oh, okay, so tell me what part of that research, because you've stated this thesis that gender inequality is the cause on your website, and yet there's no citation there. Normally, if you give it sort of something that seems like an evidence-based assertion, you would expect there'd be a little footnote and you could find out what learned journal that came from. Well, there's nothing. And so these two women couldn't tell him. You'd think it would be top of their head. They said, I'll have to take it on notice. Now, they still haven't given him an answer, and I just don't think that's good enough.
I've looked carefully at that research. It's the most shonky research imaginable. I asked for the evidence that they were using to support these assertions. There's none of it. I mean, there is evidence, of course. If you look around the world, it is a gender issue. It is about misogynist attitudes in certain countries.
In Islamist countries.
Yeah, if you go to Saudi Arabia, if you go to
where
Afghanistan,
women are oppressed.
And that is the point, that if you're in Western countries, Europe, Australia, America, that is not the cause of domestic violence. That's not what the evidence actually shows to be underlying this immense social problem.
But what about the role of alcohol, drugs, poverty?
Right.
We know, for example, that for every domestic incident in a middle-class suburb in Australia, there's 25 in a remote Indigenous community. Doesn't that point to the role of alcohol, drugs and poverty?
Well,
Absolutely.
also Senator Leinhelm asked that exact question. He said, what evidence is there that gender inequality is more of a factor than poverty, drug, alcohol abuse? And the women again couldn't give him any answer. Now, you would think that if you're running a program that is telling little kids, little boys, that they are sexist, and that telling their parents that these little boys are incipient wife bashers, you would think that you would have that evidence at your fingertips to give to a senator who asks the question in Senate estimates.
But we, of course, have Malcolm Turnbull up there saying it's all about respect for women.
Yeah.
They're all singing
and Michaelia Cash.
Yeah, the same songbook, and that's what all our bureaucracies supporting domestic violence research are saying. No one ever dares talk out about these real causes. And like also mental health issues is another major one that never gets a look in. And yet we have 40 years of research showing this is a really complex problem, showing what the causes are. And our government is spending hundreds of millions of dollars promoting misinformation about domestic violence.
And this is such a waste and such a shame, because we know exactly where the domestic violence hotspots are. Every 3 months, the Bureau of Crime Statistics and the ABS brings out these stats. We know they're Walgett, they're Blacktown. These places, we know where they are, so you could use that money, that $30 million for this program, $100 million here. You could use that to really target those hotspots, actually do some intensive social work there and help these people to break out of that cycle of violence and dysfunction that they're in. You could help their children. You could give them jobs. You could train them. But no, we waste this money on making middle-class people feel virtuous.
And of course, we don't address the other issue, which is the women. Most violent homes, the women are violent as well as the men. That's what all the research
And the children are victims.
And the children are witnessing violence between both their parents, and they're much more, in fact, likely to be afraid of their mothers in that situation.
But they're also being hurt themselves.
Of course they are.
Children are part of the domestic violence
epidemic. That's how the cycle of violence has continued. We are totally lying about what children in Australia are witnessing. It's not just about dad demonising the family. It's about mum and dad not knowing how to handle conflict other than have a go physically at each other.
And the kids.
And we're doing nothing about it.
Well, today, Miranda, you wrote about this $30 million Stop It at the Start campaign, and it seems like it's based on political correct language control. What are they trying to wipe out phrases like boys will be boys and man up? I mean, is this what they're really spending the money on?
And Little Princess, Bossy Boots. These are all apparently phrases that are going to make us all become domestic violence perpetrators.
I can't call my daughter Little Princess,
no,
even though she is my little princess, and I love her dearly. Is that what we're getting into?
Exactly. It's the same sort of craziness that you see where fairy tales are being banned. Cinderella and Goldilocks and Jack and the Beanstalk. Somehow these are reinforcing negative gender stereotypes, and they also cause domestic violence.
Well, you're watching Mark Latham's Outsiders. If you can help our show covering the costs, we've got a support page, support.marklathamsoutsiders.com. I mentioned earlier questions from our viewers. We've got one from Frank Costello from Canberra. Bettina, he's asking about the new domestic violence tax. They've actually levied a tax in the ACT. He's saying he's not done anything wrong. Why is he paying a tax for the minority of men who might be involved in these incidents, and women also, I suppose, domestic violence tax? And he's wondering, how is the money going to be spent?
Well, it's a very good question, and particularly when we've been talking about this socio-economic link, and Canberra is a peculiarly affluent community compared to many other parts of Australia, and I would imagine if we look carefully at the incidence of domestic violence in Canberra, it's far lower than many of the other areas we've been talking about. So to clobber them with, I think he said he's paying $30.
Yeah, $30 domestic violence tax.
It just is nonsensical, but it says something about the ACT government.
It serves them right, though, for continuing to vote in those crazy ACT government.
That's right.
The green left kind of people that they have running that whatever it is.
Geez, Dan Andrews can't be far behind, though, in levying a tax, can he? The Andrews government in Victoria is crazy about it.
They're talking
about it.
Yeah,
right.
they're talking about that in many places. And this question of what it's being spent on, are propaganda campaigns arguing that it's all about men, demonising men, and not addressing the issues with
and demonising little boys as well. There's
That's
that terrible ad that the federal government paid for, in which you see a little boy and a little girl are in a kitchen. The little boy runs out the sort of swing door and just thoughtlessly it gets hits the little girl as she's going through, and she's all upset. And the mother says something like, "Oh, don't worry about him. He just does it because he likes you." What parent ever says that to a daughter that a little boy who obviously hadn't deliberately, but supposedly deliberately hurt her, that he only did it because he liked you? Who says that?
Yeah, well, it's causing a lot of resentment. I get feedback from men saying, Mark, I'm doing the right thing at home. I respect women. I'm miles ahead of my father, my grandfather in this area. Why all this demonisation? Why all the talk that I'm doing something wrong? Frank Costello's saying that in the ACT, and it's a very, very common backlash, really, among men who are miles ahead of their fathers and grandfathers and wondering why are they copying it with taxpayer-funded campaigns, the nonsense we see in Victoria of trying to brainwash 4-year-olds who've been identified sexist behaviour. I mean, this is just
Look, most Australian blokes are
are
doing a really good job. They're not violent towards their families. You were the one, Mark, who dug out that statistic. Pointing out that only 1.5%.
The left feminists are saying there's an epidemic, and if you looked at the ABS statistics, it showed 1.5%, which is hardly
and
epidemic.
Stable over a decade.
And concentrated, heavily concentrated in Indigenous areas and public housing
physical
estates.
Violence. Yeah. But of course, what they do is wrap up this tiny little percentage of physical violence with everything else under the sun. Emotional violence, financial violence. They always trying to expand the definition so that they can say domestic violence is always increasing. And that's part of this whole policy, if you like, to try to make it appear a much more serious problem than it is. I'm not saying domestic violence isn't a serious problem, and it's an extremely good thing that we've addressed the problem facing women who are living in a situation where they're at risk from their partners. But we have to look at the truth and the overall situation.
And what David Leyonhjelm pointed out as well in that Senate estimates little to and fro was that men comprise a third. He's more than a third of domestic violence victims, and in fact, unlike the rate with women, which has remained stable over the last decade according to the ABS, numbers for men have gone from 0.4% to 0.6%. So they have actually increased by a third over that period.
Yeah, and of course they get nothing. Male victims of violence in Australia get no funding whatsoever. If they call the police and the police come in to investigate, the chances are the man will get arrested. Amazing story. Last year in New South Wales, they announced the first ever funding for victims of domestic violence in Australia, for male victims, and then they turned around and gave that funding to an organisation which for years has been saying there are no male victims of domestic violence, and now their major expertise is in determining which of the men who pretend to be victims are actually perpetrators. So, I mean, they've put the head, the fox in charge of the chicken.
No, but why is this? What underlying it all? What is the purpose of sort of capturing domestic violence, which is a real issue and there are real victims, capturing it and ensuring that the real victims aren't helped, but instead you're perpetrating some other different ideology. What is the reason for this?
Well, it's a philosophy they're trying to push. It's based in the neo-Marxist idea of trying to convince a certain identity group, in this case women, that they're massively oppressed in society and to make them unhappy and, you know, want them to rise up with discontent. So the idea that we're a patriarchy, that women are automatically oppressed,
and
comes from radical left,
yeah.
And men are automatically the villains, comes from radical leftist politics. It's not supported by the statistics. And I think, Bettina, your point is absolutely vital, that unless you identify a problem accurately, you won't have any public policy chance of actually solving it. So the left feminists with this nonsense, unsupported by research, unsupported by evidence, are actually doing an injustice to the women who are suffering in certain communities where domestic violence is a serious problem. There's no targeting of the communities where it's concentrated.
And the children in those families.
Yeah, but the nexus is where the government funds these leftist nonsense ideas. So where is the due diligence from public servants and from the ministers in charge of the money, our money, to actually say, where is the evidence for this $30 million program? We've spent $30 million on a program whose central thesis is unproven, and there is no evidence to prove it because it defies common sense.
There is this vast amount of research, 1,700 peer-reviewed papers I could give any one of these ministers that shows the complexity of this problem.
So Michaelia Cash and Malcolm Turnbull, who stood up, it was Malcolm Turnbull's first act after becoming Prime Minister, after taking the job from Tony Abbott in September 2015. He and Michaelia Cash stood up in the Prime Minister's courtyard and they announced another one of these ridiculous programs which demonise men. This was something that had been set up in there, to be fair, by the Abbott government. Tony Abbott, who's seen as some sort of, macho man, he actually fell for it. He spoke to Rosie Batty was behind it. This was money, domestic violence money, put into that whole Rosie Batty campaign.
Well, then Rosie Batty bagged Tony Abbott, of course, with the change of Prime
Minister.
Minister.
You never get thanks.
But I'll tell you what's happening with the politicians. They thought, spending money on these ideological campaigns, that they could win the female vote. And I think it's backfiring. I think the resentment among men indicates that it's not a vote winner, and I think a lot of women are starting to tweak to the fact
it's not just men, it's mothers of sons do not, and wives of husbands who are being demonised don't appreciate
women with brothers, and they've seen this happening. They aren't mugs, our community. They see what's going on. Women write to me about their violent mothers and growing up in a family like that. I tell you what's interesting about this whole campaign is there's a famous woman called Erin Pizzey who was the first woman to start a domestic violence refuge in the world, in Britain, and she started this refuge and all these women came in and she discovered a lot of the women were actually violent to other women in the refuge, violent to their children. And she started to speak out about that. And all hell broke loose. I mean, this was the start of the women's movement. She was hounded out of Britain. Her dog was killed. She had death threats.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she's very interesting. We're having we're all speaking this year at a international conference on men's issues, and Erin Pizzey is going to be speaking there.
Terrific. Yeah.
And she's going to talk about the fact that this was a really deliberate strategy on the part of the feminists. When their initial wave of enthusiasm for the women's movement started to die down, they seized on domestic violence as the issue no one can quarrel with. No one can say, oh, well, I don't believe you when you say you're a victim of domestic violence. I don't believe this is a serious issue. I mean, if a politician latches onto this issue, I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, he'll get a lot of brownie points from the feminist movement.
On Twitter.
From the women, yeah. And it has convinced bureaucrats and politicians around the world that this is a vote winner.
Yeah, well, what's happened...
And it's been a real winner for the feminist
movement. I want to make a point about Mark Latham's Outsiders, because basically you won't find this kind of detailed, informed, evidence-based discussion about domestic violence in the mainstream media. What happened there was Rosie Batty went through a tragedy, a terrible loss, but then she was used as an advocate for the patriarchy argument and was turned into a secular saint. And the media essentially go down that path and won't listen to evidence and counter-arguments. So that's why we're here, to give you the information you just don't hear for a variety of reasons in the mainstream media. And I think it's a classic example of why our forum is needed, to put out the information so people can hear the other side of the story, the accurate side of the story, and make up their own mind. Now, Bettina, we've got other questions from our viewers. Now, Scott from Adelaide, in a related matter, has said, a tough question, when and how will men get a fair go in the family court?
It's a very good question, and a question I've been looking at and worrying about for 30 years, because I used to write a lot about family law issues. I was on government committees trying to reform family law. Interestingly, that was during Howard's era. He was the only politician we've had in Australia who was in power and actually tried to address this issue. He introduced very important policies about children having should be enabled to have contact with both parents after divorce. That should be a presumption under the Family Law Act. And he really tried to address this issue and got a fair distance, I think, and it's all been wound back ever since. One of the things I'm hoping we will talk about at this conference in June on the Gold Coast is this sort of issue. We've got experts from around the world flying in to discuss family law systems around the world. The same problem, enormously anti-male, setting up incredible obstacles for men who are trying to be good fathers after divorce. The same problem around the world in terms of ABOs, of allegations of violence being used as a strategy in courts. We have a fantastic guy, Miranda and I have interviewed him on your radio program, Augusta Zimmerman, who's a law reform commissioner from Western Australia, who's really concerned about what's happening under the law in Australia with regard to constantly depriving men of their basic rights under the law to protect themselves against false allegations. So there are a lot of issues here. We have to get moving. The people who know this experience of the bias in the family court have to get... It's not going to change unless we all get together and work together to try to find a way of influencing our system as it is now.
Yeah, well, I suppose child support's a related issue.
Absolutely.
That's very difficult for men as well. Another question that's come in, Miranda, from your namesake in Melbourne, Miranda. She's asking, what about homeschooling as an opportunity to avoid putting kids in the hands of lunatics? And I assume she's talking about neo-Marxist safe schools.
Well, she's from Victoria.
Respectful relationships program. Is homeschooling a viable alternative? And what can we otherwise do about the insidious safe schools program?
Well, look, I would have been against homeschooling some years ago because I think that you really owe it to your children to have them embedded in the culture and not to be somehow separate and outside it. But I've changed my mind. I've met a few people who have been homeschooled in America, and they are anything but socially inept. They're very socially agile, and they're also incredibly well educated in the sort of Western civilization canon, which seems to be not taught at all at schools at the moment. They also know how to read, which is another problem with schools. So I really don't think that there's a lot of value add at the moment with our schools, and particularly in Victoria when they're just inserting so much, social mumbo jumbo, safe schools, anti-domestic violence, calling kids sexist when they're 5 years old, denying them fairy tales, stopping them playing with toys they want. Little boys very full of energy, no longer allowed to play in the playground. They're punished and chastised, therefore, when they're a bit fidgety in the classroom. It's a really hostile environment for particularly for little boys, and little boys are also less inclined to learn to pick up reading if they're not taught by phonics, which is the old-fashioned way of spelling out words like k, at, t, and that was banished again by leftist teacher unions in the 60s and 70s. So all in all, I think that homeschooling, if you are able to do it and able to combine with other parents, I think it's definitely a way of trying to save your children from this sort of insidious leftist brainwashing. The only other thing I'll say, though, is that really family is more important, and I think you can bring up children to be impervious and to resist all this brainwashing that the teachers' unions and that the Andrews government and, other governments, safe schools, you have to remember, was brought in by the coalition government. So I think that strong families, as long as you talk to your children, you can actually keep out the worst of that kind of ideology.
Yeah, I think family is the key, because what I find insidious is the idea that the parents are losing responsibility to the schools for the teaching of sexuality, gender, behaviour, values. These are things that traditionally have been the preserve of the home. Now, I think part of Safe Schools is a direct attack on nuclear family and the values of nuclear family and the responsibilities of parents. Now, I look at it that, you know, we know the teachers of our children, you do as much as you can, but ultimately they're still relative strangers compared to the intensity, the time, the love, the care, the discussions we have in the family home. And a lot of these teachers are good, some not so good, but they are very distant from the amount of time we spend with our children as parents. And the parent will always be the best teacher. That's the reality. And I'd much rather see the schools go down the path of academic rigour. It's disgraceful. Who would have thought Australia could fall behind Borat's Kazakhstan in the International League table, because they're teaching this ideological mumbo-jumbo instead of the rigour of the academic curriculum.
And they're not teaching children to read at those early days. And the children who most fall behind are boys, and particularly kids who do not have parents at home who are able to read to them or able to pick up that they're having problems.
I do think that, can't we also fight back? I mean, their parents can be a very powerful group if they get together and get active.
But they don't really know. If you're a parent at a school, you don't want your child to be punished by you complaining. It's very difficult.
But if you get enough parents involved, you can.
Well, don't you know, Miranda, of an example around Epping in the northern area of Sydney, where the Asian parents got very active and lobbied their
They certainly did, and this was over Safe Schools.
I think this is an example for us.
But that was an issue, absolutely. It was an issue where finally parents decided to do something about it, and that was because they were actually... they didn't know how bad Safe Schools were until a few journalists actually showed them what was going on, and a few very brave politicians stood up and said that this was wrong. And then you had a whole lot of Chinese Australian parents who got together, they wrote a petition, and they were very influential with their local members. And when I say very influential, I mean Safe Schools still exists, you know, and the federal funding runs out in June 30 this year. Now, in Victoria, the Andrews government is continuing it. Who knows what will happen in other states? New South Wales, I've been told, it will not continue, but it will be replaced by a broader anti-bullying program.
But I think those protests by the Asian parents around Epping Way made a very important point, because you'll hear the lefties say that pushing back against cultural Marxism and programs like Safe Schools, it's just white people doing it. I tell you what, you're out of touch if you think that. Get out there and talk to the parents from an Asian background who regard this stuff as abhorrent as anything you could find in the school curricula. They push their kids. They want the homework. They want the academic rigour. They want the doctors, the scientists, the engineers, the mathematicians of the future. They don't want safe schools. So this is not something that's restricted to a certain ethnic group in Australia. It's very widespread across the community. Now, I've got a few questions that I'm fielding here. Craig from Sydney has asked, have I changed sides or have the goalposts moved ideologically? Kim has asked me to explain my change in political views. Well, I've got to say to Craig, Kim and many others who asked this question about my political views, I don't really feel that they've changed a lot from what was the gold standard social democratic Labor model in the 1980s, where you believe in the open economy, competition, grow the economy, but you also believed in social cohesiveness. And I've got to say that I've been judging the evidence over the last 2 or 3 years. I absolutely despise the idea of a safe space in a university that separates white and black students so they can't have Indigenous reconciliation. I despise what Miranda was reporting at the playgroup in inner Sydney, where a young mum was locked out, told to go away because she identified as an Australian. How can that be multiculturalism if people can't get to know each other, become friends, share culture, share background, share experiences? So I believe very much from a Labor background in social capital, in people trusting each other, in being brought together. You know, the old Bob Hawke motto of bringing people together so we can have the thing called the good society. There's no way forward through segregation. And a lot of these safe spaces and so-called multicultural playgroups, the trigger warning culture, the idea of cultural appropriation that's being spread by the left, that people can't share in another culture. You can't go to a Thai restaurant if you come from a European background unless you're asking permission at the door. This is all nonsense that is segregating Australians away from each other. And for me, from a Labor background, you know, I cringe at the idea of someone like Sam Dastyari out there using the word white as a form of abuse in politics. He's head of the new skin colour left, abusing people because they're white. I mean, you can't look at the ABC or Fairfax now, and the Labor Party and the Green, without hearing this concept of white male privilege. Well, I represented an electorate in the southwest of Sydney, Werriwa, where the white men in the public housing estates had the bum out of their pants and were really, really struggling. So this idea of white male privilege, what about just judging people on their merits individually according to socio-economic need? That's the background that I learnt from great Labor men like Gough Whitlam, meritocracy. Martin Luther King said it best, don't judge people by the colour of their skin, judge them by their character, their work ethic and their contribution to community. So as I've looked at the march through institutions by the left, I regard it as anti-Labor. I'm not a conservative. I maintain that I'm a social democrat believing in the good society, and I think the goalposts have moved effectively, Craig and Kim and others, that the goalposts have moved, and anyone who thinks that this is good stuff coming from the left, you will rue the day that people like Bill Shorten ever allowed the Labor Party to go down the path of divisive identity politics, judging people by gender, race and sexuality. You'll rue the day that you introduce segregation into our country. And I fight this from my background, just as Miranda fights it from a conservative background. Others fight it from the conservative perspective. And quite frankly, we're now in a political environment. You've got Islamic radicals at one end of the spectrum wanting to wipe out the best things about Western civilization. You've got the left at the other end segregating, anti-white racism, judging people on identity instead of their socio-economic need. We're fighting mutant strains at both ends of the political spectrum, and quite frankly, Conservatives and Social Democrats should get together to say we're not putting up with this. We might have had our differences in the past, but one thing uniting Conservatives and Labor, true Labor people now, is the idea that these are mutant strains, un-Australian ways of thinking and doing things, and we've got to push back in our institutions to reclaim our country and reclaim our values. So that's my best answer to the questions.
Well, there's an unholy alliance, as you just said, between leftists and Islamists, even though Islamists would go out of their way to squash and kill everything that leftists seem to hold dear, particularly all their little identity groups.
And a protection racket, the ABC refusing to report the sins of radical Islam, as expressed in the radicalisation of Punchbowl Boys High, and those comments that Kaiser Trad made about domestic violence, saying that it can be legitimised in the reading of their holy book. So when you get to the point where they adopt the doctrine of white male privilege, they're arguing that everyone else in society is automatically oppressed. Radical Islamists are let off the hook in terms of their personal responsibility, and the ABC doesn't even report these terrible developments in key institutions like a school, a government school.
And they're obsessed about Islamophobia, which, you know, non-existent mythical Islamophobic attacks, and yet when there are actually Christophobic attacks on Christians wearing crosses on Sydney trains, this is something that just goes unremarked. We just don't even, there's no way that Christians can be victims, even though you see all around the world that Christianity is the most persecuted religion.
Well, you're watching Mark Latham's Outsiders. We're live Facebook streaming. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you can support us, there's a support page, support.marklathamsoutsiders.com. We've got a question from Sam. What is cultural Marxism and how is it growing in society? What's your understanding of it, Bettina?
I think you should answer that.
Well, Miranda?
Well, look, cultural Marxism is, I think, about dividing people up. Instead of, it used to be, Marx used to talk about class. Now, instead, we don't care about class. All we care about is you being a member of a particular victim group. And, you know, whether you're, you know, what colour of your skin, what faith group you're in, what sexuality you are. It's all about dividing and conquering people, and that is where the power is.
Yeah, I think, Sam, cultural Marxism really comes from this idea that the Marxist project is to control us all. We know what happened in the old Soviet Union, that they tried to control the means of production, the economy. It fell over because people wouldn't work hard and there was no incentive to grow the economy under state control. So economic control fell over as a Marxist project. It's true to say that Marxists have tried to control social services, but trust in government has fallen away. The Marxists have moved on to a new frontier of culture. This is why we call it cultural Marxism, where they're trying to control our values, our beliefs, our language, Political correctness is essentially language control, where you can't say things like boys will be boys or man up. They're trying to control our language. I've had recent experience on this. You can't criticise people because of the snowflake or grievance culture, victimology. The truth is that cultural Marxism has moved effectively into feelings and behaviour. They're trying to mould the feelings and behaviour of 4-year-old preschool students and safe schools students and respectful relationships. Feelings and behaviour. You hear a lot about this in the exaggerated talk in the mental health industry. Trying to control feelings and behaviour. The Marxists missed out in controlling economics. They missed out in controlling social services. They missed out in controlling governments because they can barely get a vote. But they've moved on to cultural Marxism through institutions to try and control our values, our feelings and behaviour. And domestic violence is another example.
I think they're not trying. They're doing a really good job.
That's
the terrible thing. And that we're allowing it to happen. We're allowing the ABC to systematically bias their reporting on a whole range of issues, and our government lets them get away with it. We allow, the whole university sector to be absolutely captured by a particular ideology, and schools, you name it. And I think, that it's really important that people stop complaining about all of this and start to do something about it.
So, Sam, hopefully that answers your question. It's a long piece of history, but crucial to Australia's future. That's the truth of it. I look at this primarily as a parent to say I don't want my children and ultimately grandchildren growing up in an environment where merit and individual need is chucked out the window for this neo-Marxist ideological rubbish. So,
and originally Marxism was about reorganising around class, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and now it's about reorganising around identity groups.
Yes, identity groups is where they've moved on to. And a related question, Bev from Mildura has asked, how do we stop indoctrination of children while at school and university? What is the answer, Miranda? We've identified the problem. What should we be doing?
Well, putting pressure on your local member, on your politicians, saying that you will not put up with safe schools and so on, demanding that there be parental consent for any kind of sexual education, and then importantly talking to your children, being available. It's not about quality time, it's about quantity time, always allowing them to discuss anything that you might, when you're talking to your child, it's not something that they say to you directly, it's just they might drop a very important issue that's worrying them as an afterthought in a sort of a casual conversation. So I think for parents to really understand and inoculate their children against the indoctrination that is inevitably going to come, whether it comes from school or the media, you need to actually have a really good line of communication with your own children.
Absolutely. More than ever, it's important for parents to talk to their children, teenagers in particular, about values, feelings, behaviour, sexuality, gender. Because if you're off isolated from your children, not spending face-to-face time with them, you can be guaranteed, unfortunately, this insidious neo-Marxism in schools and universities will be talking to your children.
And I think we have to actually also, so in the universities, we have to support people who aren't sucked into all of this and give them courage to stand up to it. And it's very difficult for individuals. Whenever I write about any of this stuff, I have to look really hard to find an academic willing to be quoted on domestic violence or sexual harassment or whatever it is. And they're all nervous because they know they're in a really hostile culture if they object to the way our laws are heading and so on. But those who do, we have to give them their support.
Yeah, we do.
And we have to encourage others to come out and stand up and be counted. And that's a difficult task. So many people have been cowered into silence.
Yeah, here's a question topical for this time of the year and our little item here. Sandra is asking, what do you think about the removal of the word Easter replaced with icon or hunting eggs? We've got the attack on the nuclear family. Goodness gracious, they're now attacking the humble Easter egg. There's no limit to these people, is there? They've got the madness of changing pedestrian lights as some pro-female thing. They've got the madness of, ABC days where no men are allowed to do any broadcasting. The poor old Easter egg, who would have thought, Miranda?
Well, it's just political correctness again, isn't it? And do you know, it's the same when it comes to Christmas, calling it Happy Holidays and so on. And it's supposedly a bow to multicultural society. It's not at all, because the Muslims, the Hindus and so on, who don't have Christmas or perhaps Easter as part of their religious ceremonies, they are not the ones crying out. They're quite happy to tolerate that in the Western society, that they enjoy living in. And it's not them who are crying out to banish Easter eggs and Christmas. No, it's these leftists again, the cultural Marxists.
There was this example on the Central Coast, a school in the Central Coast this week, where they were going to make Easter bonnets for the
That's right.
And you know, the teachers were worried whether this was going to be insensitive and so on. But they asked the parents, and everyone said it's fine. And even in this multicultural community,
of course,
no one minded at all. And so they went ahead and made Easter bonnets.
Well, good on them.
That's what we have to do.
In my family, if I can just personalise it, we're not Christian, but I always teach my children that Jesus must have been the greatest moral teacher ever. He must have been a combination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. Charismatic, a moral teacher, unprecedented in the history of humankind. So you can always learn from reading the Bible. People who aren't Christian should respect Christian practices, respect Easter, respect Christmas time, and I think it's abhorrent to go down the path of banning things to do with Easter, when for your average child at the Easter hat parade at school, I've been to plenty, it's just plain good fun. It's plain good fun.
And Muslims who are not Islamists believe that Jesus was a prophet, so they don't find Jesus to be despicable. If a Muslim does, that means that they're an Islamist.
Well, apparently we're also getting a lot of questions about how you can buy the Mark Latham Outsiders mug. Well, we've got a web page coming soon. It could be an Easter treat. And if there's enough interest, we'll have to get up a merchandise page. There's a group selling the T-shirts, Mark Latham's Outsiders T-shirts. I'm glad you like the mug. A very good friend of mine, Renae, who lives near Camden, went to the trouble of getting us the 3 mugs. She thought our drink bottles were a little bit unbecoming for such a fine, wonderful show. So merchandise could be the name of the game, but most importantly, we're trying to put the good information out for you here at Mark Latham's Outsiders. And a lot of questions about North Korea. Brendan in particular was asking, do you think now is the time to go into North Korea before they get too strong? Can I just say that I find the situation in North Korea more troubling than anything in the Middle East. I think the Middle East by and large is a quagmire, a sectarian civil war. But for Australia's interest, what's been happening with the dictatorship in North Korea, the development of longer range missiles, a few of them just sort of plop into the ocean, and speculation that they're going to have nuclear capacity. I think that this is the main issue for Donald Trump. It has to be leveraged through the Chinese. The Chinese, on one of my trips there when I was a parliamentarian, said that North Korea was looking to reform itself to become open, to go through the whole perestroika process that had occurred in the Soviet Union. When George W. Bush included them in the axis of evil, it forced the military there to become harder line, and the whole debacle in Iraq actually held back reform in North Korea. It would be most desirable if the Chinese could say to the leadership in North Korea, economic openness and growth has worked for China. Going down the path of economic closure has got the North Korean people eating the bark off the trees. It's been an economic basket case for way too long, too much money spent on weapons. So hopefully Trump, in his meeting recently with Xi Jinping, can get some leverage on the Chinese, and the Chinese themselves. Australia should be arguing this, I think, to the Chinese, one of our great trading partners. We've had productive relations with them for so long. I think it's primarily their responsibility to wind back the madness in North Korea, and if they don't, though, and the North Koreans develop a nuclear missile capacity that puts the United States or Japan in danger, I think Trump would have every right to take that capacity out to strike first, because what's happening there is very concerning indeed.
Well, and I think this afternoon we heard that Xi Jinping has contacted Donald Trump. It was interesting that he was actually having dinner with Donald Trump when Trump fired those missiles into the Syrian military base. And so, you know, the New York Times, Washington Post, Paul McGough in the Sydney Morning Herald, those type of journalists were saying, oh, it was an insult to China. In fact, it was a very good thing to show that America now, unlike the 8 years of Obama when nothing happened, that America's might was just kept in a drawer, now this is an exhibition that America is mighty militarily and is willing, though I don't think Donald Trump will be stupid enough to go forward in Syria unless there are more chemical weapons, but is willing to actually use its strength. And so I think the fact that the Chinese now are saying to Donald Trump, we want to help when it comes to North Korea, is a very good sign.
Yeah, well, North Korea really can't survive without the Chinese support, and if the Chinese played a very strong role, I'm sure we'd see sanity prevail in North Korea, and they could democratise, open up their economy, and become a regular part of the international community instead of starving their people and essentially putting their people at risk now, because it's, you know, as if they could ever win a war against the United States. This sort of talk is madness. Now, a question from William Burke, who's part of Sustainable Australia, a group I addressed recently on the question of immigration and housing affordability. William has said that he's visited southwest Sydney recently. I think I know the district there just south of Campbelltown through to Appin. And he was looking at the loss of farmland, the bushland and the koala habitat, which has been around Wedderburn for many, many years. It's all lost to housing. How do we create a sustainable Australia? I think it's relevant to the debate about housing affordability. Labor's policy, advocated by Chris Bowen, is to effectively pour more money. The money will rush into negative gearing for new housing stock. That adds to urban sprawl and congestion. It's no answer for areas on the edge of Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne and Perth. The Liberals talk a bit about housing supply, but the basic truth is there's plenty of supply in the housing market. A whole new city is being built between Camden and Penrith in Western Sydney, big urban expansion in Melbourne and Perth and Brisbane, but all the housing supply is eaten up by excessive demand. Australia runs the world's biggest immigration program, 200,000 plus. They call it Big Australia. The Labor and Liberal Party like big immigration because they're into the ethnic branch stacking and sucking up to the ethnic leadership in the local electorates. The business community likes it. The economists like it because it artificially pumps up the GDP figures. The people who don't like it are where I live on the urban fringe, the typical outsiders, people on the urban fringe battling through all the traffic congestion, these new housing estates springing up like anthills. The truth is the logical solution to housing affordability and environmental sustainability is end the era of Big Australia. Radically cut the immigration program. We've got the biggest immigration program per head of population in the Western world. Cut it now. Ease the demand for housing, and of course that brings down pricing. Now, the truth is every Year 11 economics student would know that if you reduce demand in any economic market, you start to bring down the prices. So you won't find a solution on the supply side. You won't find a solution with Bowen's advocacy of fiddling around with the tax system. The best answer is to reduce immigration, to ease the pricing increases in housing, to actually bring the prices down and to make our cities more efficient and sustainable. The irony, of course, for Chris Bowen, I know for a fact when he came in to Parliament in 2004, he was the beneficiary of one of the biggest ethnic branch stacking operations in history of the New South Wales Labor Party. Then he became Immigration Minister in the Rudd-Gillard period and was supporting. So he's the last person who should be advocating a policy area here that's not addressing demand side pressures in immigration. So Chris Bowen needs to get real. Forget all his rhetoric about tax fiddling. It's nonsense. Forget about Scott Morrison with little bond mechanisms he's bringing back from London. The political class are ignoring the thing that's ripping off and trying to con the Australian people that there's some easy answer in housing affordability unless you do something about immigration. So William Burke, you're doing a great job at Sustainable Australia, and I think we need to see the politicians get real about the size of the immigration growth.
I think Barnaby Joyce was right when he said this afternoon, though, that housing affordability is only an issue really in Sydney and Melbourne. In Tamworth, in New South Wales, outback New South Wales, you can buy a house for $300,000. And so it's. I don't think that Scott Morrison's little thought bubble of digging into our super to buy houses, all that's going to do is make houses more inaffordable in Sydney and Melbourne. And the real problem is that money is so cheap. I mean, when my husband bought his first house in the 90s, interest rates were 15%. They're 4% now. So it makes sense when the top marginal rate of tax is 49% for people to put their money into investment properties and to force up the price of housing. It's a way of people making wealth now. And I think a good way of bringing prices down very quickly would be for the federal government to tell the state governments, or New South Wales and Victoria anyway, to scrap stamp duty. They were supposed to do that when they got the GST. It adds something like 10%, I think, to the cost of a house, and it's very hard to get together the deposit when you've also got to pay this enormous stamp duty.
Well, I think we've got to acknowledge now we're running up against time a little bit. We will finish at 9 p.m. And Miranda, there's a question here from Glenn about that car bombing incident in Canberra. I think it affected the Australian Christian Lobby building down there. He wants to know why the media and police black out on the Canberra car bomber from 3 months ago. Why has the media been silenced? I know you've been following that story. Australian Christian Lobby is going through a terrible period, all this oppression and attacks on them from the militant gay left lobby. What happened there with the car bomber? Where's it going to end?
Yeah, it's a pincer movement. It's the militant gay lobby plus it's the Islamists. Well, it was a really curious attack. It was a car bombing. Somebody took a van packed with gas cylinders and parked it right, in fact, in the head of the ACL, Lyle Shelton's parking space, in a sort of obscure part of Canberra, a sort of an industrial estate, but just a couple of kilometres from Parliament House just before Christmas, about 9 o'clock one night, and blew it up. Now, thankfully, not all the cylinders blew up. I think only a couple of them blew up. If all of them had, you'd have half the block would have been flattened. As it was, the building was quite badly damaged. Luckily, there was nobody there. The alleged driver was injured. Now, the curious thing was that the ACT Police, which is a branch of the AFP, called a press conference the next day, and they claimed that there was no political, ideological or religious motivation for this attack, which was a really curious thing to say, considering that they based that declaration on a very short interview. A couple of junior police officers went to the hospital and interviewed the alleged driver and got this information from him before he then plunged into a coma and was moved apparently to Sydney to a burns unit without any police guard. Now, the police have been extremely odd. I find it, as a former police reporter, I find their blackout on information here very strange. I know that they are doing what police often do, which is to background reporters, telling them, no, there's nothing to see here. But in fact, it took until a Senate Estimates Committee hearing, and I can't remember if it was Senator Lionhelm, but a senator
I think
actually...
it was, yeah. I think it was.
Asking the AFP Commissioner, Andrew Colvin, what went on there. And there was a piece of information that was elicited from that little conversation, which Lyle Shelton hadn't been told about for 3 months of asking and being concerned for his staff about moving back into that office. And that was that, yes, it was a deliberate targeting of their building. It wasn't just some random attempted suicide, as the police had been backgrounding reporters. It was a deliberate targeting. Now, Lyle Shelton and the ACL still don't know what the motive, if there was one, of this deliberate targeting was. The police won't tell them. I tried and tried to get, as the Daily Telegraph has, to get some more information. They have gone stum, and nobody knows why. It is one of the most curious mysteries, I think, of current day policing.
Well, we're lucky to have you on the job, Miranda, and if you're reporting it in the Daily Telegraph, it'll be accurate, like all your wonderful columns, and you can update us here at Mark Latham's Outsiders. Bettina, thanks for being here this evening. I'm absolutely delighted when our website becomes live and active that you'll have a special segment there, Men's Issues with Bettina Arndt, because, as I said last week, as I'll always say, because you haven't run the Ann Summers, Rosie Batty narrative about issues, you've been an underutilised resource in the mainstream media. That's not the case here. I'm thrilled that you're going to have that input on the web page and continue to
and we'll give them some of the references we've been talking about so people can follow up.
Okay,
our discussions too.
Fantastic. So thank you to the viewers. Hopefully you've enjoyed the show, but most importantly, of course, get the good information about what's happening in our country. That's what we aim to achieve here at Mark Latham's Outsiders. Thanks for tuning in. And, of course, the Facebook facility means that the show remains there on the Facebook page. We had 57,000 views of it over the past week for our first episode. Hopefully we'll have that kind of success again. Hopefully you get the information. Make up your own mind what's happening in Australia. Ignore a lot of the stuff that's in the mainstream media. We give you the good guff, and we look forward to seeing you again at 8 p.m. next Wednesday night. Have a great Easter. Have a great Easter and lots of eggs. Good on you.